The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Network Collective's latest webinar on the topic of what can you expect from the mobile market in 2018. My name is John Waterhouse, and I'm CEO of the Network Collective, and I'll be your host for the next 20 minutes. As I'm sure everyone joining knows, TNC is the UK's largest independent network and telecom strategy and sourcing consultancy. We support over 240 major UK and multinational companies to get the best commercial, technical, operational and contractual results from their network and telecoms solutions. And joining me today is our head of consulting, Adrian Joyce. Adrian, would you like to say hello to everyone?
Good afternoon, everyone.
So before we get stuck into the meat of the webinar, just a couple of housekeeping points. So we're going to be very strict on sticking to the 20-minute timetable. Everyone joining will get a copy of the slides at the end of the webinar, and we will try to respond to any questions at the end. So do send us any questions during the webinar, but any we don't have time to answer, we will respond to on email afterwards. Right. So the purpose of today's webinar, let's get right down to it. So what we want to do in the next 20 minutes is put the whole topic of the mobile market in 2018 under the microscope. So a couple of quick useful points, as again, I've already said, I think everyone joining the webinar knows TNC undertakes more procurement processes for mobility services in the UK than any other consultancy. So obviously we have a really broad view across the market, so we can see what's going on, all the latest trends, etc., etc. And of course, we are 100% vendor independent, so we've no ties of any nature to any service provider, never have, never will. So again, we'll not only get a great view across the market, we're also viewing it in an entirely impartial way. So my colleague here, Adrian, wrote a really interesting blog post about the mobile market in 2018 a couple of weeks ago, and it got a huge amount of interest. So we thought it'd be really interesting to do this webinar and to drill down into some of the topics which he touched on, particularly around the commercial trends, around Wi-Fi calling, data usage, etc., etc., and talking a bit more detail about those things. And what's behind this is we find that with all the procurement processes we run, obviously we get a lot of the same questions over and over from customers. So we want to tease out the three questions we get the most often and tackle those on this webinar. So the three questions we're going to tackle are, mobile costs have fallen a lot over recent years. Are there still cost savings to be had? With mobility becoming increasingly important to how organizations work, and particularly how they communicate and collaborate, coverage is critical. Is Wi-Fi calling the answer to coverage problems? And finally, how should organizations deal with ever increasing data usage and data volumes? Obviously, both to satisfy the needs of their users, but without spending too much money. So, Adrian, looking at the first slide and the first question, my favorite question of the day, are there still savings to be made in mobility costs?
Well, the first line of the slide gives away the answer, John. Yes, there are. I think it's very interesting, your point about pricing falling for a number of years. Is there a bottom to this? Is there a floor? Well, certainly we're not there yet. We continue to see both for our existing clients where we're renegotiating contracts that maybe we procured or negotiated 2-3 years ago. We're seeing pricing still falling. It's not unsurprising to see sort of 15-20% discount on the previous deal. Equally for brand new customers to us, potentially who haven't reviewed their contract for a number of years, it's a little bit old and tired. We have seen up to just beyond 50% savings just on things like the actual OPEX itself.
Wow, that's really big numbers.
It is, and quite surprising to some of our customers that it's gone down so much.
And what's behind that? Is that one big part of the contract where the prices are coming down? Is that across the board? What's driving that size of cost reduction?
Yeah, I think it's across the board. I think one of the most important things that I've drummed into you, John, since the first day I arrived here, is how important the tech fund is. Now, clearly, the tech fund is a form of cashback. It's a form of rebate that you get on committed spend. That committed spend is designed, it's predicated on the length of that contract. So if you signed a contract 2 years ago for 2 years, you got a tech fund related to that 2-year period. If you don't re-sign that contract and renew that tech fund, you're no longer receiving the tech fund, and in effect, you're diluting that deal. So straight away, the first thing to do is renew your deal, get it on up-to-date tariffs, generally which have fallen, but also refresh that tech fund. Now that tech fund, it can come in a number of different ways. The vendors like to sell it as a hardware fund. It's better for their cash flow. It's sort of a bit wooden dollars, but you can get them as airtime credits. Occasionally, and with persistence, you can get some or sometimes all of that tech fund as a cash element. So a comedy check at the beginning of the contract. So that's very important to ensure that your tech fund is being refreshed.
Well, what about on the tariff front? So I see on the slide you talk about Roam Like at Home, more for less on data and calls. So you see tariff reductions as well as the tech fund elements.
Yeah, the structuring of tariffs continues to sort of yo-yo between pence per minute, group bundles, and it's sort of couple of years, one will be in fashion, then another will come into fashion. So we're less focused on whether it's pence per minute, whether it's bundles, but the overall holistic value of that deal to that customer. The EU regulations for Roam Like at Home, they fundamentally were based for the consumer, not for enterprises. However, for probably sort of 95% of the deals that we see at the moment, enterprise customers are receiving that benefit. Those few deals where that isn't the case is something we challenge and pretty much have always been successful in persuading the vendor to pass those benefits on. So that has had a big impact to any organisation that has business in Europe. But equally, if your organisation allows use of your phone when on holiday, well, the majority of us go on holiday in Europe. So it's a great benefit, not just for consumers, but also for our enterprise employees. In terms of more for less, clearly one of the later slides and topics is the ever-increasing amount of data being used. And what we're finding is that the price you were paying a year, 2 years ago for 1 gig is probably the price you'll get now for 3 gig. So the vendors are responding to that, trying to maintain their revenue, but giving you more for that same revenue.
So if I summarise, so there are still big savings to be had in mobility, but it's coming across in a number of ways. You know, a big tech fund obviously is a great element to any deal, but in all the other parts of the tariff as well, the prices should have gone down, and yes, fundamentally things you were paying for in your last contract, say EU roaming data, yeah, or excess data usage, fundamentally you're not going to be paying in your new contract. So okay, I can see how that's.
It's even some of the older contracts. Maybe if you've got a contract 3-4 years, you may have been paying for 4G access.
Right.
You know, and that's something today is default. It's standard. You shouldn't be paying any more for that.
Okay, so that's a good news story. So a lot of good savings to be had. So that's very interesting. So let's move on to the second topic. So we're talking about coverage now, and in particular, obviously, coverage is always a challenge. Is Wi-Fi calling the answer to mobile coverage?
So again, first line spells it out for you there, John. For some it is. And we broadly agree with what the vendors, the network operators say on this. It works wellish maybe is a better answer, for the individual. So working at home, small office, it works reasonably well. There are some problems. It's not necessarily 100% consistent. So you and I, John, use Wi-Fi calling when we're at home, and quite often the signal will drop. So the Wi-Fi drops, something happens, and you have to re-establish the call. However, it's a lot better than having, no signal in.
Sure. I was just thinking one of us should have dialed in on Wi-Fi calling for this webinar. We could demo it for real. Yeah, probably.
Then there's other aspects. There's no 999 location on Wi-Fi calling. Now this may not be relevant for the majority of people, but there might be some enterprises out there that have lone workers, remote workers, working with vulnerable people, where that might be an important element to bear in mind. Compatibility, it needs to be a relatively new phone with the newer chipset. Majority of the phones, certainly the higher end phones over the last couple of years, so from sort of the S7s on Samsung, the iPhone 6s, have that chipset, so they're compatible. But if you have an older estate, Wi-Fi calling might not be answered because your phones might not be compatible with it. So you might need then to think about refreshing the hardware, and is that actually worth it? So that's something to bear in mind. And then finally, the handoff to the cellular network. So moving in and out of Wi-Fi into cellular coverage can be problematic. Now, different vendors have different designs around this. Some seem to work better than others. Some work well when you're going between 4G and Wi-Fi, but don't work if you're going between 3G and Wi-Fi. So really, again, when you and I are talking and you're going out to the car, the call will drop. Frustrating, but again, better than no signal.
But this is a solution, just looking further down the slide, this is a solution in the home office, small office environment. We're not seeing this as a solution in larger offices.
No, and as I said at the outset, we're generally supportive of the vendor's statement on this. They absolutely say this is not a substitute for in-building coverage. Now, as you know, John, I'm fairly cynical when it comes to marketing, sales pitches, and what vendors tell our customers. So I did take that with a pinch of salt. I was wondering whether they were defending the revenue and the service that they bring within building coverage. However, there are a number of technical reasons why I support their position on this. There's some obvious things. Is your corporate Wi-Fi man enough for the job? Mm-hmm. Do you have enough Wi-Fi there? Is it already under strain from standard use? Concurrent call handling. So the majority of corporate Wi-Fi is now dual band, will handle 5 gigahertz. That will only allow 18 concurrent calls on it. So if you're in an office of hundreds of people, you may run into problems quite quickly. You get a similar problem between the handoffs from cellular networks, but also you potentially might get handoff issues as you walk around an office.
Oh, so within APs and changing between APs and so on. Okay.
Yeah, can be problematic. I think there are settings, there are flavors that work better than others. Your Wi-Fi probably doesn't have quality of service for voice. It certainly probably wasn't put in with voice being thought about. And again, if someone next to you is downloading a massive document and you're trying to make a Wi-Fi call, you may struggle. So the network operators say it doesn't work. I think there's probably a tipping point for an office whereby, unfortunately, you still have to invest in some proper kit.
And by proper kit, obviously, you talk about the more traditional in-building solutions. I mean, the challenge we've seen historically within building solutions is there barriers to change within the market, right? So if you've invested 100K in building solutions from vendor number one, moving to vendor number two becomes that much more difficult.
Yeah, you've spent that money at some cost. Now you're going to have to replicate that. It's a hard business case to argue. I think the other thing we've also noted at the Network Collective over the last year or so is the amount of noise about coverage. So a couple of years ago, we had many customers complaining that their network operators' coverage was poor.
Mm-hmm. And that was across the board, right? That wasn't just vendor A or B, that was...
Yeah, there were certainly one or two vendors that seemed to get more complaint than others, okay. But yes, generally. But what we found, specifically perhaps with those poorer performing vendors from a couple of years ago, we would address it with them when we'd meet their senior people, and they would tell us how many millions or billions that they were investing in coverage. And again, the cynical side of us was like, well, at the end of the day, it's outcome driven. Our customers are still complaining about coverage. However, I must say, we get far fewer complaints about coverage across all vendors now than we did a couple of years ago. Now, that might not mean that the signal will now penetrate a building that it didn't penetrate previously. There are physical issues that may prevent that. But generally, roaming around the country, it's a lot better.
Okay, and is that because, for example, 4G rollouts are much more complete now?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's two things. One 4G rollout has been a massive undertaking, but also the vendors have done a lot around black spots. So there's been a lot of publicity. The government have been trying to tackle it. There's been fears from the vendors that the government would enforce national roaming, which they didn't want to do. So they have been tackling it. Yes, there are still black spots. There will still be black spots. I think you're seeing some of the regulations from Ofcom, some of the license conditions are enforcing some of the vendors to get certain thresholds. We're also seeing EE, who won the 999 contract. They've got certain conditions that they've got to fulfill. So all of them are working on coverage. You'll see the adverts from various celebrities, whether they're Kevin Bacon's or guy from Love Actually, I can't remember, Martin Freeman.
Martin Freeman.
Yeah, on Vodafone.
Did you not have this in your notes for the webinar?
I don't. I've got his poster up at home, but not on my webinar.
Okay, very interesting. So again, just to summarise, so your short answer is right. So Wi-Fi calling seems like a good solution in most cases, particularly for home workers or people in small offices. Outside of that, not so useful. Okay, third and final question, given we are heading towards the end of our time. Data usage. Obviously, this is a huge topic. And I know you've got some stats for us on data growth, but even without the stats, we all know data volumes are increasing substantially. How are organisations dealing with this? And I'm interested in that from two standpoints. One, how are they facilitating it? Because no one wants to turn around to their organisation and say, sorry, you can't have any more data. But equally, people have got budgets, they've got cost constraints. So how are they?
Yeah, I think it's important to take a step back and just have a think about why people are using more data. I think in the consumer market, it's quite obvious. Social media has been massive. People are doing a lot more streaming. So whilst a few years ago on the tube, people would read newspapers and books, everyone's looking at video now. Some of those people will be streaming it live. So in the consumer market, it's quite obvious. In the enterprise market, I think it's lagged behind, but certainly the average usage that we're seeing is consistently going up. Ericsson are predicting 45% year-on-year growth. I couldn't disagree with that. What we're seeing is changing demographics. So you're getting sort of Generation Y people coming into the workplace who've only ever known mobile phones.
Are we Generation Y, Adrian?
We're a little bit beyond, I think, Generation D or E. Enterprises are putting more apps on for their customers, but also for directly for their employees. We've numerous examples. I'm sure people on the webinar will have their own examples, but whether it's rotoring, whether it's booking holidays, whether it's checking stock, all of these sort of things. People are actually using streaming legitimately for work. And I know you looked at my bill recently, John, that was honestly all work. But equally, people are using their enterprise.
And this is what, when you say streaming legitimately, you're talking about video calling, you're talking about accessing from tutorials.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So we're using a new Microsoft application at the moment, Power BI. There's some great videos on YouTube of how to best use it. So, people are looking at that sort of thing. They're looking at the content on websites that previously was text. There are now video introductions to telcos, to retailers, whoever it might be. Once they're getting a lot more over the top comms, so people are using WhatsApp. So instead of texting in the traditional SMS way, instead of making a native call, they're using WhatsApp, they're using Facebook Messenger, things of that nature. Loads of stuff out there in the cloud, obviously, but even social media, we think about that. We used to think about that as a consumer product. It's now within the workplace. People are using Facebook as a method to reach their customers, and therefore there's a reason to be on there for work purposes and collaboration tools. I think the other thing that I've noticed a lot of people doing is tapping away on their laptop, writing a report, but using their phone as the research tool. So Googling things rather than switching on their laptop between screens. And of course, the availability of 4G. Having 4G means that you can stream. It means you can look at that video content.
Actually, I going to say exactly that. There's definitely a push and a pull here, isn't there?
Yeah.
That when you know, I find it for myself, when I have the capability, you use it in a way you wouldn't have done previously. Okay, so conscious supply.
Yeah, just very quickly, the other couple of things I'd say just before we move on. Seeing a lot more customers replace voice-only handsets with smartphones, giving smartphones to people that you wouldn't necessarily expect to have a smartphone. A very common example is giving it to the cleaners. Why would you give a smartphone to the cleaner? So that they can show you that they've cleaned the problem. Likewise, in, for example, the transport industry, phenomenal growth in the use of data there, whether it's for public Wi-Fi, whether it's CCTV, whether it's driver behavior, numerous examples. You can have a bus now, might have 6 or 7 SIM cards doing different things, offering different services. So all around, we're seeing massive uptake and growth in data usage. So what are organizations doing about it? Well, the first thing that they should do is define the policy. Do you allow personal use? Do you not? What is appropriate? What isn't? Then it's enforcement of that policy. So many organizations are happy for people to use their phone for personal, but if you're not, well, make sure that you're policing that and that you're making people aware that they're going against the policy or that they're using excessive data.
Do organisations need tools for that? Because that can be challenging, right?
Yeah, there are some very good tools out there. They're relatively cheap, but they still come at cost. You can rely upon the vendor portals. They tend to be a little bit slower, a little bit clunkier, but they can be sufficient enough to say, John Waterhouse has used 40 gigs worth of data this month. What he was doing on it, you might not know. Yeah. There are other applications that, NDM type applications that can sit on your device that would say 35 of John's 40 gig was Netflix. Might not be in work.
Right. Okay.
Other things, estate management. We consistently see companies organizations not very good at maintaining the estate and determining whether someone has left.
Right. Okay. Now, so this is paying for devices and so on that you no longer need.
Yeah, and guess what? If you've left them with their device and 3 months after leaving they still can use it, they might not start following the policy. And we had one very famous example where someone had used 96 gig in a month. It was their highest user, and we did a little bit of investigation for this company and said, we've cyber stalked them on LinkedIn. It looks like they haven't worked for you for 4 or 5 years. And it turned out to be the case. They didn't know where that device was. They didn't know who was using it. They turned it off, no complaints. But, those abuses will happen. The other things I appreciate, sorry, John, we're a little bit over time. Tariff management. If you've got a tariff that has bolt-ons for particular users, for heavy users, it's essential that you or your vendor is managing that correctly. That not only are you putting them on, but also taking them off. This is particularly the case where it's where you're roaming outside of Europe, because the cost can be eye-watering there. The other thing, and the big thing that we go after is tariff restructuring, is looking at the tariff that you have had that may not have served you well, may not have had enough data, may have had onerous overage rates, and ensuring that you renegotiate with your vendor, possibly at the end of the contract, but also in contract, to get a better deal for what you're doing.
That's a really key point. I know one of the things which you said to me many times, talking about mobile, the structure of these sorts of deals. Organisations do a deal based on their requirements on the day that deal is done. Of course, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the line, their requirements have changed. They've just brought a company in Brazil.
Yeah.
But they didn't put roaming rates to Brazil into the original contract, and what a surprise to get absolutely hit with roaming costs. So that continual review of the tariff,
it's essential.
It's absolutely, yeah.
And it's a missed opportunity if you don't do it. I think the final one is letting the business know what to expect. It's budgeting. If you're seeing your costs going up and you don't have any further control on your tariff, well, then you need to alert the business to the fact that you'll probably end up spending more.
Yeah. And why, presumably.
If you know.
Yeah. Adrian, very, very interesting stuff. We're going to try and get through a couple of questions just very quickly. So there's one here. Would you try and incorporate a refresh policy in the mobile telephony contract? So I'm presuming that's a device refresh policy in there, or potentially that could be a benchmarking. What's your view on those two? I think we've tended to feel that it's challenging benchmarking when you're on a 2-year contract anyway. But what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think probably we need to follow that question up and dig a little bit more into what it is that's being asked there. In terms of hardware, at the beginning of a contract, really it's horses for courses. What is the state of your current hardware? If it's all old and broken, then yes, I would incorporate that into a refresh. However, we are seeing a lot of organisations that are saying, well, we've got iPhone 6s, they still do the job. It's 1 or 2 with cracked screens, I'll replace those, but why replace it with a £600 iPhone 8?
And of course, that's a wider trend that's going on in the market. We've seen a lot of organisations switching away from regular hardware refresh on demand. Yeah,
leasing as well has been becoming ever more interesting. So putting it into OPEX rather than a large upfront payment.
Very interesting. We're over time. We're going to call it a day. We have got a few other questions, so we'll respond to those on email. But thank you, Adrian, very much for your expertise. Very interesting. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to talking to you again on our next webinar.